Good afternoon, everyone. In the last lecture, we finished up our time with Aristotle by talking about the highest happiness that's available to us, contemplative activity, as Aristotle puts it, or the activity of philosophical thinking. Now, let me remind you of the 4 lives aimed at happiness that most people choose. Remember, this was in Book 1, where Aristotle describes the life of pleasure, honor, or money-making. And he shows that none of these are truly ultimate goods for various reasons. But recall that there was a 4th option there, contemplation, which he said he'd talk about later. Well, Book 10 is one of those spots that he considers contemplation, as we saw. Now, as it turns out, a life of contemplation is the best life to live, even better than the practical life of moral virtue that we spent most of our time on in Aristotle. And it's appropriate that we did spend so much time on it, since it's the best life we can reasonably hope for. But contemplation is the best life absolutely speaking. It belongs to us not as human beings with bodies that need to be cared for and desires that need to be controlled, etc. Rather, it belongs to us insofar as we have a divine element in us, reason. And we must strive to not just follow reason in our actions, as a life of moral virtue does, but also perfect this faculty by strengthening it and directing it towards the highest things that we can think about. This is the intellectual life, the life of the mind. If you want to see what the intellectual life looks like from a somewhat theological perspective, I'd highly recommend Father Sertalange's The Intellectual Life. I'll write this title on the lecture outline in case you're interested. He was a French Dominican who was a scholar of Thomas Aquinas, in fact. And Aquinas is what you've read for today. So let's move on to that. I'm trusting that by this point in your Benedictine academic career, you've read Aquinas, probably a number of times, between your philosophy and theology courses. So I won't say anything in way of introduction, but let me remind you that most of his writings are divided up into a number of larger questions, which are subdivided into articles. Now, what we're reading from is taken from its part that's taken from the Summa Theologiae, which is Aquinas' most popular work, probably. The Summa is actually written for beginners in theology, believe it or not. The selections we're reading are from a part of the Summa that's commonly referred to as the Treatise on Law, and that's a name you see in your ethics reader. Now, question 90, the first one that you read for today, concerns the essence of law. Aquinas builds up a sort of definition of law in Article 4 that says that law is nothing else than an ordering of reason for the common good by him who has care of the community and promulgated. So these are the essential parts of law. Let's take a look at each one of them as he goes through them in the first 4 articles. In Article 1, Aquinas gives the etymology of law, which we should note. He says that law, lex in Latin, in which he's writing, comes from the verb to bind, ligare. Actually, he uses the future passive participle, as you'll see in the book, but that, of course, is also a form of ligare. So law is something that binds one to act. Now, interestingly, we could note that you'll see the same root in the word religion, which is also a sort of binding. But what is it that binds us, rules us, and measures us in human action? That's the question. Coming out of Aristotle, we're not surprised to see that reason is the source of this binding. And it's also not surprising to see Aquinas referencing Aristotle. We should get used to this, since Aristotle is far and away Aquinas' most important philosophical source. Aquinas takes Aristotle very seriously and relies on his reasoning in many, many contexts in his own writings. He simply refers to him as the philosopher, as I mentioned when we began reading Aristotle. So Aquinas says, it belongs to reason to order things to an end, which is the first principle of all matters of action, according to the philosopher. Now remember, this is what we saw in Aristotle. All human action aims at an end that reason determines is best. This is the starting point, the first principle, as he says, of human action. Okay, so all law derives from reason. What else? In Article 2, we learn that the first principle of human action from Article 1 can be made more specific. He says, the first principle in practical matters, which are the object of the practical reason, is the final end. And the final end of human life is happiness or blessedness. Now, this is all review for us, having just read Aristotle. But notice the technical vocabulary that's developing here. It's all very precise. There's a part of our reason that's concerned with practical matters, that is, things that we can make or do. This part of us is called practical reason. And practical matters are what he calls the object of practical reason. And the first principle of these objects is the final end, and this is happiness. Now, this is exactly what Aristotle said, but you can see the terminology solidifying and the arguments getting more compact. This is one of the reasons, I suppose, that medieval philosophy can be a little intimidating. But we have nothing to fear. We just want to get a general understanding here. And with the conceptual background that we have from Aristotle, I think we're in good shape. Now, the next part of the argument in Article 2, to get back to Article 2, that we want to notice here is that although ordered to happiness in a unique way, we're also part of a perfect community. So each person, even though they're ordered to happiness in a unique way, is also part of what he calls a perfect community. That is, an all-encompassing community. So we're each part of a larger whole. So we're ordered not just to our own private happiness, but also to a common happiness, or we could say a common good. And this mention of common good leads us to the third part of law, which is discussed in Article 3. If the good is common, then the ordering to the good involves the whole people who are being ordered. Now, as he recognizes, this might not always be plausible. So instead of the whole people, the ordering might be done by what he calls a vice-regent. Now, this is a literal translation of the Latin that he's using here. What he means, as he says in the next sentence, is a public personage who has care of the whole people. A ruler, in other words. Now, finally, in Article 4, Aquinas notes that in order to be binding, as a law must be, it must be applied to those who are ruled by it. Now, the application here, he says, is promulgation, that is, a public announcement of the law. Now that we know what the essence of law is, the next task is to figure out the various kinds of law. And this is what Aquinas takes up in question 91. So in Article 2 of question 91, we see for the first time a mention of the possibility of a natural law. Now this is going to be our focus for our time with Aquinas. But in order to understand natural law, it's helpful to contrast it with other types of law. And this is what Aquinas does in Articles 2 and 3. So in Article 2, he begins by reminding us that rule and measure are part of the essence of law, as we've already seen. But rule and measure belong both to the one who is doing the ruling and measuring and to the one who is being ruled or measured. So in the case of human actions, who is the ruler or measurer? Aquinas' answer is God. All things are subject to divine providence, he says, which rules by means of what he calls eternal law. He continues, all things partake somewhat of the eternal law, insofar as they derive their respective inclinations to their proper acts and ends by being imprinted on them. So the inclinations that are proper to each creature are imprinted, stamped on their nature, almost programmed into them, is a suggestion here. And this word inclination, we should note, is very important. We'll see it again later. Think about the image of being on an incline, a ramp or something. It's a sort of tendency towards this or that. And this is what we mean by inclination. Kind of interesting spatial image there. Now, once again, these inclinations are stamped into the nature of each creature. But rational creatures are unique in their share in divine providence. He says the rational creature is subject to divine providence in the most excellent way, insofar as it partakes of a share of providence by being provident both for itself and others. So in other words, rationality allows human beings to provide for themselves and others in a unique way, by being lawgivers themselves, by ordering themselves and others to their final end, which we know is happiness. Now, what we call natural law is precisely the participation in God's eternal law. What this boils down to is what Aquinas says at the end of Article 2. The light of natural reason, whereby we discern what is good and what is evil, which is the function of the natural law, is nothing else than an imprint on us of the divine light. But natural law and eternal law are not what we usually think of as law, right? We think of the laws that are written down and enforced in a political community, the ones we have to obey or we get a ticket or arrested or something. Now, these are what Aquinas refers to as human laws, which he discusses in Article 3. Fairly briefly, you'll see. He says that human laws are actually derived from natural law as a more particular determination of certain matters, which are discovered by human reason. So by considering the natural law, which is quite general, as we'll see, we can derive more specific commands. And these specific commands are the human laws that we're familiar with. And we'll see how all this works later. Now that we've determined what law is and the varieties of law and how they're connected, we can move on to a consideration of natural law itself, which takes place in question 94. So we're skipping ahead a bit, as you can see by the numbers. In his discussion of natural law, one way of understanding what Aquinas is doing is that he's asking the question, how can we determine what laws are binding on us? Are there certain moral commands that we can't not know? That is, that everyone must know. This is a big question, a very important question. Now, in order to answer it, he begins with what is most well known in itself, even if we haven't thought about it before. So like a good philosopher, he begins with being. It might help to take a look at the Porphyrion tree diagram from the outline for Lecture 5 that I gave you. Now you can see on that diagram that being is the most general category that there is. Everything that exists has being. And no one can be ignorant of being, since, as Aquinas points out, it's included in all things whatsoever someone apprehends. But from the notion of being, we can derive what he calls a first indemonstrable principle of thought that everyone must recognize. Now, we usually refer to this principle as the principle of non-contradiction. Here, Aquinas formulates it as, quote, the same thing cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time. Now, this might sound somewhat abstruse, but I promise you that you're very familiar with what he's talking about here. Let's look at a couple examples. What if I say, the restaurant opens at 5 and serves dinner from 4 to 9? Does this make sense? Not on the face of it, right? How could the restaurant start serving dinner an hour before it opens? Now you're going to start going through different possibilities in your mind, right? Maybe the person meant 5 a.m. rather than 5 p.m. That would make sense, right? So you're going to try to save the sense. Otherwise, the statement just plainly doesn't make sense. But some statements would be impossible to save in any straightforward way. What if I say that I don't like fish, then later in the conversation that I love tuna sandwiches? Does this make sense? No, it doesn't. Why not? It involves a blatant contradiction. If you don't like fish, you don't like tuna either, because tuna is a fish. This statement violates the principle of non-contradiction, the most basic principle of human thought. And no one who has anything that counts as thought at all could not see this if it were brought to their attention. This is what it means to make sense. Now, here's a sort of bait and switch by Aquinas. He's got us thinking about first principles of thought, how they work, and how easy they are to understand. But what we want to get at ultimately is a different aspect of thought with a different first principle. But it's parallel. It concerns not being, but rather good. It's the good, as we well know, that concerns us for ethics. Being and the principle of non-contradiction are correlated with what Aquinas calls speculative reason. But what we want for ethics is practical reason, the reason concerned with doing or performing actions. Now, practical reason, as I've already suggested, has a parallel structure to speculative reason. Instead of beginning with being, it begins with the notion of good. This is what Aquinas says, the first thing that falls under the apprehension of practical reason. Since he adds, every agent acts for an end under the aspect of good. Now this should sound very familiar to us because it is exactly what we got at the beginning of Aristotle. Every action aims at some good. And the good, as Aquinas reminds us, is that which all things desire. Now, the first principle of practical reason that corresponds to the principle of non-contradiction here is that good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. Now, this is the first and most basic principle of ethics, and he adds, all the other precepts of the natural law are based upon this. But how does this work? How are the other laws of the moral law derived from this one? Well, we'll continue with this question tomorrow, but here at the end of Article 2, we get a short list of the most basic goods that are sought by human beings. These are the goods that are governed by the precepts of the natural law. They're based on the natural inclinations, what he calls, of human beings. First, there are inclinations that we share, he says, with all substances. These are inclinations to the preservation of its own being according to its nature. So as living things, we human beings have an inclination to preserve ourselves in certain ways, and these ways of self-preservation must be governed by natural law. Second, we have inclinations that pertain to us according to the nature which he, a human being, has in common with other animals. Now, what he means here, he says, is sexual reproduction and care for offspring. thirdly and lastly, we have inclinations according to the nature of reason, he says. These are the inclinations that are specifically human. And the examples that he gives are to know the truth about God and to live in society. Now, everything that falls under these inclinations is subject to natural law and is therefore, at least in principle, available to everyone through human reason alone. And that's the big answer here to the question that we raised at the beginning. Now, tomorrow we'll continue with Aquinas on natural law as we get more details about how his theory works, and we'll also take a look at an application of his natural law theory that's made use of by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. So I'll talk to you tomorrow.